Hello, I'm Claire Smith and welcome to my channel. So today's video is going to be a kind of perfume glossary for types of fragrance. So these terms are all things that I might say about a fragrance, and I just thought that would be useful for people watching my reviews of fragrances to really understand completely exactly what I mean when I say a particular thing about a fragrance. I think these terms are pretty widely used on YouTube, so hopefully this will be useful in you watching other fragrance content. I did make a video a while back about the fragrance wheel, and I've noticed that that video is getting more and more popular, and I just thought maybe people want some more detail on really examples of fragrances that fit into different categories of fragrance. So if you haven't seen me before, I'm Claire Smith. I make videos all about perfume, perfume science, perfume history, perfume psychology, and I also just do some straight perfume reviews and also fun perfume tags. So if that kind of thing interests you and you haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing, and please also like this video if you do like this kind of content. So I'll leave that previous fragrance wheel video down below, and I'll also leave some perfumery kind of basics videos down below in case you do want to check those out as well. They're more about projection, longevity, notes, accords, and also fragrance concentrations. But for today's video, it's going to be more about types of fragrance. So let's get on with this. Let's start off at A. So first off, I'm going to talk about aldehydic fragrances. So what do I mean by aldehydic fragrances? I mean those that contain aldehydes very detectably. And aldehydes can smell different in different fragrances, and that is what makes them a little bit tricky sometimes to detect. But other times they are just very front and centre, and I think the aldehyde that most people would be able to pick out would be something like the aldehydes that are in Chanel No. 5. So they're very soapy, and they really do make that fragrance Chanel No. 5. Without aldehydes, it would be a very, very different fragrance. But I think if you've only smelled aldehydes in Chanel fragrances, then perhaps try them elsewhere if you're not so sure about them. So I really love aldehydes because they can really bring a modernity to fragrances. They can make fragrances smell almost otherworldly. They can make them smell ethereal. They can really make them kind of pop in a way, like Replica's bubble bath, where in that fragrance, the soapiness of the aldehydes is used to replicate the feeling of being in a bubble bath. There's also the feeling of the solar feel of aldehydes in fragrances like Reflection by Musky Milano. There, that fragrance just feels almost luminous with how much sunshine it seems to be packed into the bottle. And I think really that's what aldehydes can do. They can give you a bubbly feel, they can give you a golden feel, they can give you a solar feel, they can give you a slightly powdery feel, they can give you a soapy feel, they can give you a bubbly feel. Those are the kinds of smells and feelings you need to look out for in fragrances to detect aldehydes. So next, animalic fragrances, and I might describe a fragrance as being animalic when it's got a little bit of a grut about it, when it sort of makes me think, that's not quite clean. There's something a little bit dirty about it, but dirty in a good way to some people. So something that smells maybe bodily almost, something that maybe reminds people of carnal things. You know, there's some kind of pleasure, isn't there, in a slight dirtiness for some people sometimes. Of course, animalic fragrances these days aren't based on animal-derived notes most of the time. But of course now they're in synthetics based on things like castoreum from beavers, civet from civet cats, musks, and also on ambergris from sperm whales, although nowadays it's more likely to be an ambrox derivative. There are also less obvious animalic accords such as leather, which can be made up of various different things, but can definitely still give off an animalic touch to it. So where in fragrance can you smell animalic notes? Well, I think most of the time you're going to struggle in the world of designer perfumery. You're really going to have to go to niche or small brand indie to find animalic fragrances. One of the first ones on your list should be something like Papillon Artisan Perfumery. So, for example, last year I tried their fragrance Epona, and I would say that's gently animalic. To me, it really makes me think of horses. It's the idea of the hair of the horse, the mane of the horse, and just also being in a stable with a horse, the smell of the bedding of the horse as well. And that fragrance is just a really great example of something that really evokes a slight animalic touch without it being too much. I think that's a really nice beginner animalic fragrance. There are also touches in more mainstream fragrances such as Musc Ravageur by Frederic Malle, and there's also touches in more vintage designer perfumery, although it's been toned down over the years. So things like Shalimar by Guerlain, Coco by Chanel, and also Estee Lauder's Youth Dew. So next, aromatic or herbaceous kind of fragrances. And why would I describe a fragrance as being aromatic? It's going to be something that's going to contain some kind of herbal note to it. So things like rosemary, sage, mint, lavender, thyme, tarragon, oregano, cumin, coriander, cardamom, even saffron. So this category of fragrance can actually be really varied because of the different aromatic notes that are contained within it. And really fragrances can be very green and fresh in this category, or they can be quite spicy or even a little bit citrusy. So fragrances falling into this category might be things like Eau Menthe by Diptyque with its mint notes, or my own personal favourite Milano Fragranz's Basilica, which has thyme and also rosemary. You could also try MFK's Petit Matin with its lavender notes and citrus notes, and also Kenzo Jungle with its spices. So next up, I might describe a fragrance as being ambery, and that really is a catch-all term for quite a big area of fragrance, and I will probably be a little bit more specific about the area of amber that I'm referring to. Of course, this category was formerly known as the Oriental category, and some people still do use that term. So this category was really born because of Guerlain's Shalimar, and that really did just set off an explosion in perfumery, an explosion in that style of perfumery. So because amber doesn't have a specific formulation, that's really caused this category of fragrance to smell very diverse, and that's really why amber is so widely used in perfumery. So ambers can be more cola-like, more spicy, more powdery, it can be warm, more resinous, more vanillic. They really do have lots of different facets to them that could be tweaked to make fragrances smell certain ways. But in general, amber brings warmth and a richness to fragrances. So the classic amber accord is made up of a variety of different things, but really the core is the labdanum, which is warm, musky and sweet. It also usually contains benzoin, which is a powdery, vanillic-leaning resin, and also vanilla itself. But as I've said, amber can really be made up quite diversely. So sometimes you might have tonka in there, you might have patchouli in there, or you might have a different resin in there as well. So of course, Shalimar is a critical example in the amber family, but also you might want to try, for example, Dior's Ambre Nuit. That's a really beautiful rose amber fragrance that always makes me think of the world's most expensive baby powder. It's just the ultimate in luxury, that fragrance. If you want to try a cola-like amber, you might go for Ombre de Merveille by Hermès. And if you want to smell a spicy amber, you might go for Opium by YSL. Or if you want to smell a soft amber, you might go for Miss Dior Parfum by Dior. So the next category are the aquatic fragrances, and I might describe a fragrance as aquatic if it feels watery. And for me, there's a very big difference between an aquatic fragrance and an oceanic fragrance. So I would more likely call a fragrance oceanic if it's something that I sense some kind of marineness to, or something that has a bit of saltiness about it. Really, aquatic for me is something fresher. So aquatic smells are really evoked by things like watermelon, melon, cucumber, apple, those kind of fragrance notes. So fruits, also things like juniper can really make things smell very watery to me as well. Some florals are also widely used, so things like lotus and water lily. As I've said, this category also overlaps a little bit with oceanic, but it also overlaps with ozonic and also with petrichor fragrances. So you kind of have to try to separate those categories in your mind when we get to those categories. Really good examples of this category that might be a little bit unexpected would be things like Frederic Malle's En Passant, which has a definite watery feel to its floralness. And there's also fragrances like DKNY Be Delicious, which again might sound a bit odd, but that's a very fruity, aquatic kind of fragrance. So next is balsamic, and balsamic really refers to fragrances that contain resinous substances, so fragrant balms, and that's where balsamic comes from. This is especially relevant to fragrances with sweet, warm, powdery feels to them. So this category could include fragrances that contain things like benzoin, things like myrrh and Peru balsam, and also incense. So in this category, I'd choose things like maybe Grand Soir by MFK or Alien Essence Absolue, which has that really beautiful myrrh in it. So next, the category of blue fragrances, and this is a fragrance category that's really grown ever since Bleu de Chanel was released in 2010. And really from that, things like Dior Sauvage have come onto the market and have really just exploded. That's really grown to become the best-selling fragrance on the market. But why do people appreciate blue fragrances, and what are they? So blue is a very specific fresh-feeling aquatic fragrance category that really relies on its use of ambroxan. It can also use another molecule called calone, and if you want to know more about calone, then you should go and watch my How to Make Fragrances Smell Watery video. Often molecular notes such as ambroxan are combined with aromatic touches in this fragrance category, and for people who really don't like this category, that can come off as something that smells like shower gels. Men's shower gels is often how this category is described. So next is a term that I really don't use very much, but I thought I'd define it for other people because other people I think do use this term on YouTube. So this is called camphoraceous fragrances. And camphoraceous fragrances really make you think of medical ointments, of balsams that you might put on wounds. So you might also think of things like Vicks Vapor Rub if you're in the UK, and menthol if you're not. I can also think of naphthalene, so mothballs in this category. And the one fragrance in my collection that makes me always think of mothballs, at least in the opening, is Tom Ford's Orchidsoleil. I love that fragrance. It sounds weird to say that you love a fragrance that begins with mothballs, but yeah, it's just very striking. And I think this type of smell is usually something to make an impactful opening that generally fades as fragrances go on. Even old vintage Alien has that kind of camphoraceous smell to it in the beginning. So the next way I might describe a fragrance would be as a Chypre. So Chypres really represent a category of fragrance that is quite classic in perfumery. And Chypre actually translates as cypress. And Chypres really represent a particular note structure in fragrances that is very distinctive. So really the notes basically hinged around oak moss in the past, and oak moss is something that has a bit of a green silvery feel. It's kind of slightly bitter. It also has a bit of a soapiness to it as well, and really oak moss is something that's been very highly controlled in perfumery, and there are now forms of oak moss that can be bought without two particular constituents in them, which means that they can now be used still in perfumery. But actually the upper limit of the amount of natural oak moss you can put in fragrance now is actually pretty low. So most of the time oak moss is now made synthetically, or there are alternatives to the use of oak moss as well in Chypre fragrances. So the classic formulation for a Chypre fragrance would be something like a citrus top note. So it's really all about contrast, the Chypre fragrance family. So citrus top note with labdanum and patchouli in the middle, so something soft and powdery with something woody, and then oak moss down at the bottom. And really oak moss is what categorised this fragrance family, but as I've said, it's now been switched out sometimes. So really what they tend to do is they tend to ramp up the patchouli. Sometimes, patchouli is not always used in Chypres, but I feel like that's what they tend to do. They use a woody patchouli. So Chypres you will have smelt, and they're really quite ubiquitous in perfumery. So really the classic in modern perfumery would be something like Coco Mademoiselle. That fragrance clearly doesn't have oak moss, but it is still a Chypre fragrance because of that patchouli base and that really strong citrus at the top. It's also important to note here that Chypres often have rose in them. Even though that's not part of the core structure, that does tend to be a note that's actually included in Chypre fragrances, and Coco Mademoiselle is no exception. There are also fragrances that are in an even more modern style. So Bohemia, for example, by Hermès, is another example of a modern Chypre fragrance. A more classic style is something like Gris Dior by Dior. So the next category is earthy. And fragrances can smell earthy if they have particular notes that evoke the smells of soil or of moss or of things on a woodland floor, basically. So I always think of notes such as truffle. That really does distinctively make me think of that kind of damp, earthy smell you get in woodland. Also, I think of patchouli very distinctively because that really can give off a feeling of soil and earth, damp soil and earth. You can also get this feel with vetiver and also with oak moss as well. And I think the most distinctive earthy fragrances are really the ones from Tom Ford. So things like Black Orchid, Noir de Noir. The truffle note in those fragrances always makes me think of woodland, and it always makes me think of fairy tales happening in these woodlands. So another descriptor that I use quite a lot is ethereal, and ethereal fragrances are really a texture almost. They're something that's quite sheer and something almost there, but really something quite transparent, airy, something that is quite light wearing, I would say. So ethereal fragrances can really be evoked by fragrance notes such as aldehydes, iris. I always feel like silvery iris notes can really make things feel very ethereal. Sometimes heliotrope can be quite ethereal if it's not too gourmand and it's not too heavy. Also some lily of the valley if it's not too petally. And also some types of musk. So clean, very light musks can feel very ethereal. The best example of an ethereal fragrance for me is one that really showcases the note of iris, a molecular iris, and that one is called Lunar Dust by Mobilorama. Next up are the Fougères, which are also known as barbershop fragrances, although I think the term barbershop is very much more informal. So Fougere actually literally means fern, and it refers to a combination of aromatic notes with other fragrance notes such as coumarin, which gives fragrances a kind of hay-like feel, and also dry oak moss, which gives fragrances a slightly green, foresty feel in the dry down. So Fougères are really very much associated with lavender and other aromatic notes, but really the most famous Fougères would be things like Green Irish Tweed by Creed, Chanel's Boy, and the more modern Fougères such as At the Barbershop by Replica Maison Margiela, and also Libre by YSL. So another way I might describe a fragrance is as smelling green, something that was either very fresh, something that was very grassy or leafy. So for example, I recently reviewed some fragrances from a company called Bathhouse, and there was a fragrance in their little lot that was called Climbing Trees, and that really made me think of laurel leaves in the opening. Also in this category, you can talk about the drier green fragrances, so things that might have notes such as vetiver, violet leaf, galbanum, or even some tobacco. And I put things like Chanel 19 in this part of the category, but you can also have more Mediterranean leaning kind of fragrance notes. So things that might involve aromatics like basil or thyme could also fall into this category. Everything really overlaps, and that's why it's so troublesome to try and tease out where individual fragrances sit, because sometimes they sit within more than one category. Next is pretty much, I think, the category du jour, which is gourmand fragrances. So I might describe a fragrance as being gourmand if I consider it to be edible. So gourmand literally means a lover of food. So things that might be described as edible would be things with notes like caramel, toffee, chocolate, but also the sweeter fruits. So things that aren't smelling like a natural fruit, that are smelling more like a fruit candy, I would put in this kind of category. So things that smell like a syrupy cherry or a preserved strawberry or a super sweet pear drop kind of fragrance, I would put in this category rather than in a fruity category. I might also put some forms of vanilla in this category as well, but not all vanillas. I feel like there is a very non-gourmand vanilla that's sometimes with woods, and there's also like the Guerlain vanilla, which generally to me is not gourmand. So those vanillas I wouldn't put in here, but the other vanillas, the more sort of vanilla essence, cakey vanillas, the Kayali vanilla, I would put in the gourmand section. So a classic gourmand choice would be something like Angel, even though nowadays I don't think a lot of people would actually consider that fragrance too gourmand. Other gourmands would be things like Devotion by Dolce & Gabbana, or something really popular these days like Bianco Latte from Giardini di Toscana. Next up, I might describe a fragrance as being indolic, and this is something you're not going to smell every day in designer fragrance because indoles can smell off-putting to some people. So indoles can sometimes come off as bad breath, they can come off as fecal almost, and I've actually made an entire video all about indolic fragrances and indolic fragrance notes, so I will leave that link down below, but basically it's mainly to do with white florals and yellow florals, and really the big players here are jasmine and tuberose. But also things like ylang-ylang and even other florals such as rose can have indoles in much lower concentrations. Indolic notes tend to give off a bit of sensuality almost, and I think that's why people really like them. They give off this kind of rich, very photorealistic flower smell. Sometimes in nature, flowers don't always smell pretty. They can smell oppressive almost and too much. I think if you've ever smelled a lily close up, you will know what I mean. Sometimes lilies just aren't pleasant to be around. Indoles really give fragrances a very sensual quality, and nowadays they're often put back in to other synthetic forms of jasmine and tuberose to make them more realistic. but it's still quite rare. I think for me, the one that comes off as slightly indolic would be something like Narcotic V from Nasamato. Also fragrances like Lust from Lush, that's a little bit indolic. And also very distinctively Sanajadan's Savage Jasmine. So the next category are the molecular fragrances, and for this I'm going to be quite tight on my definition because I feel like there are so many fragrances with these fragrance notes and you can't class all of them as molecular, I don't think. So molecular to me, when I'm saying something's molecular, I really mean it has a really heavy overdose of ambroxan in it, or it has a really heavy dose of isoe super in it. And really that's the main thing that you smell. So I would class things such as the eccentric molecule fragrances as molecular fragrances, and I might also class things like the fragrances marketed by Juliet Has a Gun as molecular fragrances because they use a lot of ambroxan in those fragrances. I probably would also class things like Glossier You, so the things that are quite, your skin but better, disappear, reappear, things that people can't always smell, I would class as molecular as well. I would also class Mabelorama's Lunar Dust as a molecular fragrance. The borders for this fragrance category are quite fuzzy, as with a lot of these other categories, and I think a lot of things could variously go in this category. Even some people might consider things like Baccarat Rouge a molecular fragrance. So the next category of fragrance is the musks, and musks really are quite an enveloping and very huggy feeling fragrance category in some cases. Other times musks can be quite animalic and they can really make you feel some kind of naughtiness, I guess, in the fragrances, and I think that's what some people really love about musk, the fact that it can be quite animalic. I think really, the clean white musks were very popular in the 90s, and that's probably where most people start off in their fragrance journey, with the cleaner ones, and then they move on to the dirtier ones if they want to. But yeah, I think there's just a great variety in musk, and I've actually made an entire video all about musk in fragrances and about the history of musk in fragrances and the chemistry behind musk in fragrances. So you do go check that out if you haven't already seen it. I think with musk, there's just so much to cover. I think really my favourites in this category would be things like Musk Ravageur by Frederic Malle, also Rolling in Love by Kilian. That's just such a very distinctive skin-like musk, very gentle and very soft. And then there are also things like the dark feeling musks in the base of Lolita Lempica, very distinctive. And then the powdery musks in things like Galan La Petite Robe Noire, Black Perfecto. So the next category are the Oceanic fragrances, and really for me, I don't think I would class Oceanic as my favourite fragrance category. I would also maybe describe an Oceanic fragrance as smelling slightly marine. And really that's what I'm getting at. I'm getting at something that's not a freshwater kind of fragrance, something that has a saltiness, something that has something of the sea about it. So fragrance notes that kind of evoke that for me are things like ambroxan, cologne, and also things that are maybe a little bit aromatic, so things like sage maybe, drier herbs with a kind of greenness to them. Also other notes that you might see in marine style fragrances are things like seaweed, salt, mineral notes as well. And some fragrances even list things like driftwood in their fragrance notes, very artistic. These fragrances tend to evoke the freshness, the coolness and the breeze of the marine environment. They tend to have a clean, kind of slightly ozonic feel to them, which I'm going to get onto next. And examples of this fragrance category with things like Luna Rossa by Prada, and also Zoologist's Squid, and also Maison Margiela's Sailing Day. Next up we have ozonic fragrances, and if you've ever smelt the smell you get on the underground or the metro or any kind of underground train, or if you've ever smelt the smell when you've welded something, that is the smell of ozone. And it's that smell, that kind of almost, I don't know, it smells almost like bad weather, like thunderstorms, that kind of smell. So ozone is something that's quite metallic smelling, but I've made an entire video all about petrichor, and ozone is part of the smell that makes up petrichor. But on its own, ozone gives a kind of freshness to fragrances, and it smells almost aquatic, almost marine. It's something kind of in between but more airy. So I might describe a fragrance as ozonic if it has that kind of nose tingly freshness to it. And the one fragrance in my collection that I would describe as ozonic would be something like Kenzo World. So the next descriptor I might use for a fragrance would be that it smells of petrichor. So petrichor is the smell that you get after rain, but it has to be raining on something that's been dry for a long time, something that's been outside for a long time, a natural surface that has some bacteria, and it's actually the smell of the rain hitting the bacteria that causes that petrichor smell that's so distinctive. A lot of people misunderstand petrichor as simply smelling of the rain, but it's not the rain, it's the smell of the surface after the rain. I think a lot of the time petrichor is misunderstood because of the way perfume companies present petrichor, so they kind of romanticize it. For me, the main smell of petrichor is geosmin, and geosmin is the smell of the beetroot. If you smell a uncooked beetroot, slice it open, that's geosmin, which I don't find particularly pleasant, and I don't in general want to wear as a perfume. But the more commercial perfumes are more centred around the kind of rain aspects of petrichor. So the things like Marc Jacobs Rain, for example, or things like Concrete Rain by All Saints, or even things like When the Rain Stops by Maison Margiela. So definitely more the watery side of petrichor. But I've got an entire video on petrichor if you are interested in what petrichor actually means. The next descriptor that I really do quite often use because I love floral fragrances is Petally. And this is when a fragrance literally smells 3D to me. So I can actually smell the texture of the fragrance. And quite often I get this with gardenia specifically. White floral gardenia is very thick feeling and smooth and creamy, and that really gives me the feeling of a petal quite often. Not always, but mostly I get it with gardenia, but I also get it with other fragrance notes. So sometimes, rarely, I get it with rose. Rose, really soft pink rose petals, is a very distinctive smell in perfumery, and I just think it adds another dimension to fragrances when they smell petally. Another one that you can get is frangipani, that often smells petally to me. And a great example of a perfume in the tropical category would be something like Moon Palace by Karen Timpson. You could also choose something like Chanel's Gardenia or April Aromatic's Nectar of Love. So you're looking really for more natural floral smells for them to smell petally. The next category, again, is more of a texture than necessarily a smell, and this one's powdery. So I might describe a fragrance as smelling powdery, when actually I mean more it's the texture of it. So it's more something that's kind of evoking a feeling of talcum powder, or it's something maybe that's making me think along the lines of something velvety almost. So sometimes suede can really make me think of powdery notes as well, and suede notes pair really nicely with powdery florals such as violet, iris, carnation, and also musks. So the classic choices for a powdery fragrance would be something like Insolence by Guerlain, Lipstick Rose by Frederic Malle, and also Floris's White Rose for the carnation and the iris and the musk combination in that fragrance. So next up, resinous fragrances. So resinous fragrances literally contain resins, so they'll be sap from particular plants that is formed into a sticky substance which is then used in fragrances. So things like incense and also frankincense, myrrh, labdanum and benzoin are all resinous notes, and they all give fragrances a warm balsamic feel, also sometimes a sweet or smoky feel, and sometimes a little bit of a citric edge, or sometimes a spicy edge, or sometimes a medicinal edge. Different resins have different things that kind of go along with them. So, for example, myrrh sometimes comes off as a little bit medicinal, but it can also be a little bit spicy. And frankincense, for example, often makes you think of lime. So I think the surprise for me with resinous notes is just how much I've enjoyed them. I never thought when I came into trying fragrances and being on YouTube that resins would be such a love as they are for me. I think the most friendly resin that you can probably try would be something like benzoin, because benzoin comes off as a powdery vanilla sometimes. And I think that kind of example of a fragrance would be something like Opus 3 by Amouage. There's also the classic myrrh fragrance. It's a very gentle myrrh fragrance with, only a touch of myrrh in it, but it's definitely there. And that's Alien Essence Absolue by Mugler. There's also Frank by And Fragrances for Frankincense. That really showcases frankincense in a very forward way, and it really frames it nicely with a lime note, which really gives it a very kind of gummy bear feel to it. I also have some really distinctive labdanum fragrances, and Encens Celeste is probably the most resinous feeling labdanum fragrance that I own. I could go on because I love resins. Next, an odd one. What does rich mean? Sometimes I say that fragrances smell rich. I might say they smell opulent. I might say they smell full-bodied, almost like a wine. What does that actually mean? So for me, something that's rich might have a very particularly smooth texture. It might be particularly intense, or it might have multiple layers that make it a very complex fragrance. So I think the one fragrance that springs to mind when I think of something that's very rich, that fits all of that, would be something like Black Orchid by Tom Ford. That's a very complex fragrance. It's got multiple layers. It's very smooth feeling, but it's just got this kind of deep richness to it that just is exemplary for this category. It's a very esoteric category where you kind of have to make up your own mind as to what that means. But I just thought I'd define it to try and show you what I mean when I say something smells rich. So next, solar fragrances. So I might describe a fragrance as feeling solar if it's got some solar florals in it. So for example, some yellow florals, something sunny feeling. So perhaps ylang ylang, or perhaps even some jasmine or some tuberose can also feel sunny. Or perhaps some tropical florals, so things like tiare, frangipani can also feel very sunny. It might also have something called benzyl salicylate or other salicylates in the fragrance. So for example, Alien has salicylates in it, and that's what gives that fragrance a bit of a solar feel. Salicylates were originally put in European sun creams way back in the day, and they were taken out randomly because they just weren't great sunblocks, but actually people just loved the smell, and that's really the traditional smell of a sun cream in Europe. Not so much in the US because I feel like they lean more towards coconut, but really that salicylate smell is intimately associated with holidays and beaches and sunshine, and that's why it's used in perfumery. It's also used very widely in laundry detergents. So there are also other yellowy florals such as mimosa that also give this kind of sunshiny feel to them, but we can also have aldehydes, as we've kind of already mentioned earlier on in this video. So it's really the sort of similar fragrances that you might expect from the aldehydes part of this video, really. Really the one that I would like to highlight here is Reflection, because it has that really gorgeous yellowy mimosa. It just literally smells like you are smelling sunshine, as I've said earlier in the video. With the aldehydes as well, it just amps up that feeling of brightness till it's almost fluorescent. And I think if you're looking for a solar fragrance, that's the best one I've ever smelt. So yeah, that's Milano Fragranze Reflection. The final descriptor is Soliflore. So Soliflore literally means a single flower, and it doesn't mean that it only has one flower in the notes. It just means that when you smell it as one flower. So it can be a variety of different notes and accords that are coming together to evoke the smell of just one flower. And this was really a very popular style in perfumery back in the day, but it's really faded in modern perfumery and it's become something that's less and less common. So there are very few examples that I can really think of, and some of them really don't feel that adequate. I would put things maybe like Stella by Stella McCartney as a Soliflore of rose. Even though there's peony there, the peony is contributing to the feeling of the rose. I would also put Love and Tears by Kilian as a Soliflore, because even though there's lily and there's jasmine, the lily just adds to the feeling of the jasmine in the fragrance rather than dominating it. This last one is a bit more debatable, but I always think of Orchidée Vanille as the idea of a Soliflore, but a Gourmand Soliflore. So that fragrance is the idea of the smell of the vanilla orchid. So that's the final term being defined in this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have enjoyed it, then please press the like button, and please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And please let me know, are there any other terms that you just don't understand when I talk about them? I'd be really happy to define them for you and to try to really knuckle down on some of my language around fragrance. So also thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.